A cold, solemn wind whipped across the manicured lawns of Arlington National Cemetery, rustling the thousands of flags that stood like silent sentinels over the nation's fallen. The funeral of General James McDowell was an event of national importance. Dignitaries, senators, and the highest echelons of the military gathered under a large, somber tent near the gravesite, their dark suits and immaculate dress uniforms a stark sea of formal grief. On the periphery of this distinguished crowd stood a lone figure named Elias Thorne. At 70-something, Elias looked more like a piece of the weathered landscape than a mourner. He wore an old, faded denim jacket over a simple flannel shirt, his work-worn jeans tucked into scuffed leather boots. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, his hands gnarled and calloused, and his eyes held a deep, quiet sorrow that felt more ancient than the granite tombstone surrounding them. He clutched a small, tarnished silver flask in one hand, not for drink, but as a memento, a shared token from a time and place far removed from this formal pageantry. He had no intention of joining the group under the tent. He only wanted to stand a respectful distance away, to hear the final eulogy for the man he knew not as General McDowell, but simply as Jimmy, his brother in the mud and fire of a forgotten war. As he began to walk slowly along a path that would give him a clear line of sight to the ceremony, two men in sharp, dark suits and subtle earpieces stepped forward to intercept him. They were part of the event's private security, their expressions polite but unyielding. "I'm sorry, sir," the first man said, his voice a low, professional baritone. "This area is reserved for the family and invited guests of General McDowell." "I'm not a guest," Elias replied, his own voice raspy with disuse. "I'm just here to pay my respects. I won't get any closer." The second security guard eyed Elias's worn clothes with unconcealed disdain. "Look, old-timer, this is a high-profile, formal event. You don't have credentials, you don't belong here. Your appearance is disruptive." A younger man, impeccably dressed and wearing a family pin on his lapel, strode over. He was one of General McDowell's nephews, a successful investment banker who had only ever known his uncle as a celebrated public figure. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" the nephew asked, his tone impatient. He gave Elias a dismissive once-over. This individual was trying to enter the reserved area, Mr. Chandler, the first guard explained. Chandler scoffed. "Really? Look at him. He's probably some homeless drifter looking for a handout. Get rid of him. We can't have this kind of element here today, of all days. It's disrespectful to the general's memory." Elias's quiet sorrow hardened into a steely gaze. "I knew the general longer than you've been alive, son," he said, his voice low. "We served together." Chandler let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Served with him? You? Don't be absurd. My uncle was a West Point graduate, a 4-star general. Look at you. You look like you just crawled out of a ditch. Now, leave, before I have you forcibly removed for trespassing." He turned his back on Elias, a final, cutting dismissal. "Handle it," he snapped at the guards. The guards stepped closer, forming a physical barrier. "You heard him, sir. You need to leave the cemetery grounds now." Elias looked past them, towards the ceremony under the tent. He could see the flag-draped casket, the honor guard standing at rigid attention. He wasn't going to fight them. He wasn't going to make a scene. That would be the real disrespect to Jimmy's memory. But he wasn't leaving. He simply nodded, turned, and walked 100 yards away, stopping under the shade of a large, solitary oak tree on a small rise. From there, he could still see the ceremony, albeit from a great distance. He was outside their carefully curated circle of grief, but he was still present, still keeping his silent vigil. He unscrewed the cap of the silver flask, not to drink, but just to hold it open, a quiet ritual only he and Jimmy would have understood. The funeral service began. The formal eulogies, delivered by a senator and a fellow officer, drifted towards him on the wind, filled with words like hero, statesman, and leader. Elias knew all those things were true, but he also remembered Jimmy as a scared 19-year-old kid sharing his last canteen of water in a firefight, a young man who could tell a joke that would make a whole platoon forget their fear for a few precious seconds. The nephew, Chandler, noticed Elias still lingering by the distant tree and scowled, signaling to the security guards with an angry gesture. One of the guards began walking purposefully across the grass towards Elias, clearly intending to enforce his final removal. Just as the guard reached the halfway point, the final eulogy concluded. The honor guard began the solemn, intricate process of folding the American flag that had draped the casket. At that moment, a figure of immense presence detached himself from the front row of mourners under the tent. It was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a 4-star general in his own right, his uniform covered in medals. He was supposed to accept the folded flag on behalf of the nation. But he didn't. Instead, he gave a quiet order to the honor guard commander, then turned away from the casket, his eyes scanning the crowd, then looking past them, up towards the rise. A hush fell over the attendees as they watched one of the most powerful men in the military suddenly divert from the ceremony. Chandler and the security guards looked on, confused. General Thorne's stern, formal expression melted away, replaced by one of profound recognition and a deep, somber respect when his eyes finally found the lone, weathered figure under the oak tree. Without a word to anyone around him, General Thorne began walking. Not back to his seat, not towards his waiting motorcade, but away from the ceremony, up the grassy slope, directly towards Elias Thorne. The guard who had been sent to remove Elias stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape. Chandler's smug expression dissolved into one of utter disbelief and confusion. The entire funeral, an event of national significance, had just been put on hold. Because a 4-star general had just walked out to greet the man they had cast aside like trash. The entire assembly of mourners watched in a stunned, collective silence as General Marcus Thorne, a man accustomed to commanding armies, strode purposefully up the grassy slope. The private security guard, who had been on a mission to eject Elias, was now frozen in place, looking utterly lost. Elias Thorne, still standing under the great oak, simply watched the general approach, his weathered face a mask of calm, somber acceptance. General Thorne did not slow until he was standing directly in front of Elias. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, in a move that sent a ripple of shock through the watching crowd, the 4-star chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff clicked his heels together on the soft grass, raised his hand to his brow, and delivered a slow, perfect salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, offered from one of the most powerful soldiers in the world to the old man in the faded denim jacket. Elias, his eyes shimmering with an unshed grief, slowly nodded, acknowledging the salute with the quiet dignity of a man who understood its weight. "Marcus," Elias said, his voice raspy but clear. "Figured you'd be here." "Wouldn't be anywhere else, Elias," General Thorne replied, finally lowering his hand, his voice thick with emotion. "And I was hoping, praying, you'd be here too. They told me at the entrance they hadn't seen you." "They saw me," Elias said with a wry, sad smile. "They just didn't like the look of me. Told me I was disrespecting Jimmy's memory." He glanced down at his worn clothes. "Can't say I blame them. They're fools," Thorne said, his voice hardening as he glanced back down the hill toward the nephew, Chandler, who was watching with a horrified, confused expression. "They see the uniform, but they don't know the man. They never knew Jimmy like we did. And they certainly don't know you." Just then, a flustered colonel hurried up the hill. "General Thorne, sir. Is everything all right?" "The ceremony." General Thorne turned to the colonel, his demeanor shifting back to one of command. "Everything is perfectly fine, Colonel. In fact, everything is finally as it should be." He placed a firm, guiding hand on Elias's shoulder. "I've just found Sergeant Elias Thorne, General McDowell's platoon sergeant from the 173rd Airborne. He was General McDowell's guest of honor. It seems there was a regrettable oversight at the gate. The colonel's eyes widened in recognition of the name. Sergeant Thorne? From Hill 875? The very same, General Thorne confirmed. To the world, the battle for Hill 875 was a footnote in a long, brutal war. But to the men who were there, it was everything. It was the place where then Lieutenant James McDowell's platoon was overrun, where he was wounded and left for dead. It was the place where Sergeant Elias Thorne, disobeying a direct order to retreat and save himself, charged back through a wall of enemy fire with a handful of volunteers. He single-handedly held off an enemy advance while dragging the wounded lieutenant and 2 other men to safety. Elias was grievously wounded in the process, and his recommendation for the Medal of Honor was lost in the chaos of the subsequent withdrawal, buried under decades of classified after-action reports. Elias, General Thorne said, his voice softening again. Jimmy talked about you until the very end. He always said he owed you every star on his shoulder. He never forgot. He gently took the silver flask from Elias's hand. He left this for you, you know. In his will. He said you'd know what to do with it. Tears now openly traced paths down Elias's rugged cheeks. He simply nodded, unable to speak. Come on, Sergeant, Thorne said gently. Let's go say goodbye properly. With his hand firmly on Elias's back, General Thorne began to lead him down the hill, back towards the ceremony. The crowd of dignitaries parted for them as if the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning understanding. General Thorne led Elias directly past a pale, trembling Mr. Chandler. Thorne paused, his eyes like chips of ice as he addressed the nephew. Mr. Chandler, he said, his voice low but carrying with lethal precision. This man, whom you deemed disrespectful and tried to have removed, is the only reason your uncle survived to have a family. He is the only reason you are standing here today. The legacy you were so worried about protecting? You're looking at him. Chandler visibly shrank, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost pitiable. General Thorne escorted Elias to the front row, seating him in the chair that had been reserved for the president, who was out of the country. He then walked to the honor guard, who stood waiting with the perfectly folded American flag. The young officer in charge looked to Thorne for guidance. In a stunning, final break from protocol, General Thorne didn't accept the flag. He gestured towards Elias. Present the colors to Sergeant Thorne, he commanded. The officer didn't hesitate. He marched to Elias and, with solemn formality, presented him with the nation's final tribute to his fallen friend. Elias accepted the flag, his calloused hands cradling it with a tenderness and reverence that silenced the entire cemetery. He held it to his chest, a silent communion between brothers in arms, a final salute that transcended rank, time, and even death itself. After the ceremony concluded, a remarkable thing happened. The senators, the decorated generals, the powerful men and women who had gathered to honor one of their own, did not disperse. Instead, prompted by General Thorne's profound display of respect, they formed a quiet, unassuming line. One by one, they approached the old man in the denim jacket, not to offer condolences to a stranger, but to shake the hand of Sergeant Elias Thorne, to thank him for his service, and to honor the hero who had been hidden in plain sight. Chandler and the security guards watched from a distance, utterly irrelevant, their judgment exposed as petty and meaningless. Long after the crowds had gone and the cemetery had returned to its quiet solemnity, 2 old soldiers remained by the fresh grave. General Marcus Thorne and Sergeant Elias Thorne stood side by side. Elias unscrewed the tarnished silver flask. He poured a small amount onto the earth above Jimmy's casket, then took a sip himself before passing it to Marcus. To Jimmy, Elias whispered, his voice thick. To Jimmy, Marcus echoed. They stood in silence as the wind rustled the leaves of the great oak tree on the hill, 2 living monuments to the fact that true honor isn't found in a uniform or a title, but in the quiet courage of a man's heart.